Police officers harshly interrogate an elderly black woman on her porch, accusing her of suspicious behavior. But when her son arrives, the officers suddenly go pale, realizing who they're dealing with. What do you think happened next? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new stories. Rosa Williams, a 75-year-old black woman with a lifetime of resilience etched into her face, sat quietly on the front porch of the home she had lived in for over 4 decades. The evening was calm, the air warm with the remnants of a long summer day, and the slow creak of her rocking chair provided a soothing rhythm to her thoughts. This porch had seen countless sunsets, and Rosa had spent so many of them in this exact spot, watching her neighborhood transform over the years. Once, this was a predominantly black neighborhood, families tightly connected, watching over each other, sharing stories and struggles. But those days had long since faded. The neighborhood was now a mix of newcomers, mostly white families with renovated homes, and a wary distance from their longer-tenured neighbors. Rosa saw the changes with both curiosity and sadness, especially after her old friends had moved away, replaced by people who barely made eye contact. Her home, modest and well-kept, stood as a quiet reminder of the past. The paint on the walls was chipped, but the garden was meticulously tended. She had planted every flower herself, using her hands weathered from years of work. This home wasn't just a building. It was the embodiment of her life's work, her memories, and her perseverance. And tonight, just like every other evening, she was content to sit and watch the world move around her, sipping sweet tea from a glass that shimmered in the last light of the day. Across the street, Mrs. Holland, one of the newer neighbors, was walking her small terrier. Rosa noticed that Mrs. Holland always quickened her pace when she passed Rosa's house, clutching her purse tighter as though Rosa posed some kind of unspoken threat. It wasn't the first time Rosa had seen such behavior, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. She sighed, a quiet exhalation of frustration, but she kept her dignity intact, sitting tall in her chair. After all, she'd weathered worse storms than this. Little did Rosa know that her peaceful evening would soon be shattered by something far more insidious than passing glances. In the distance, she heard the faint sound of police sirens, a noise that immediately stirred something deep inside her. The memories came rushing back, decades of encounters with law enforcement, some benign, many not. She had marched for civil rights, faced down police officers during protests, and taught her son, Daniel, to navigate a world that often treated people like them with suspicion and hostility. Yet, here she was, at the age of 75, still living in a world where her mere presence could cause alarm. The sirens grew louder, and Rosa's heart rate quickened. She told herself it was nothing, just routine police work, nothing to do with her. But when 2 police cruisers screeched to a halt a few houses down, her worst fears began to materialize. She leaned forward slightly in her chair, squinting to see what was happening. From the police cars emerged 2 white officers, both with hardened expressions and hands resting near their holsters. One of them, a tall man with a close-cropped haircut and cold, piercing blue eyes, immediately caught her attention. His partner, a woman with short brown hair, looked equally serious, though there was a hint of nervousness in her posture. Rosa could see them speaking with Mrs. Holland, who was waving her hands dramatically, pointing down the street. Rosa's stomach twisted as she realized Mrs. Holland was pointing directly toward her house. "What in the world?" she muttered under her breath, gripping the arms of her rocking chair as the officers began walking purposefully toward her. Her mind raced. Had something happened nearby? Why were they coming to her? The lead officer, the man with the cold blue eyes, was the first to speak as he neared her porch. "Ma'am, we've had a report of suspicious activity in the area," he said, his tone authoritative, bordering on accusatory. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Rosa straightened in her chair, summoning the dignity that had carried her through countless confrontations in her life. "Of course, officer," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm not sure what help I can be. I've just been sitting here enjoying the evening." The second officer, the woman, stepped forward, her demeanor slightly softer but still professional. "Ma'am, we received a call about someone matching your description walking around the neighborhood and looking into windows. Can you account for your whereabouts in the last hour?" Rosa blinked, stunned by the absurdity of the question. "Young lady," she began, her voice tinged with disbelief, "I've been right here on this porch since after lunch. I haven't moved from this spot, let alone walked around looking into windows. At my age, that would be quite the accomplishment." The male officer snorted derisively. "Yeah, right. Look, lady, we've got a witness who says otherwise. Why don't you just come clean and tell us what you were really up to?" A surge of indignation rose within Rosa, her hands trembling slightly, but her resolve as strong as ever. She met the officer's gaze, unflinching. "Young man," she said evenly, "I have lived in this house for over 40 years. I have no need to look into anyone's windows, nor do I have any inclination to. I am a law-abiding citizen, and I resent the implication that I would engage in anything criminal." The male officer's posture shifted, his body language becoming more aggressive. He took a step closer, his hand now resting on his holster. "Listen here, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Just admit you were casing the houses, and we can sort this out down at the station." Rosa's heart pounded in her chest, but she wasn't about to back down. "I have done nothing wrong, officer," she stated, her voice firm, "and I'm not going anywhere with you. If you have more questions, you can ask them right here, on my porch." The male officer's eyes narrowed. "All right, that's it. You're coming with us. Stand up slowly, and put your hands behind your back." Rosa's breath caught in her throat. Was this really happening? She thought of her son Daniel, the lessons she had taught him about standing up for justice, even when it seemed impossible. Her son, who had grown into a man she was immensely proud of, a captain in the police force, no less. What would he say if he saw this? With a deep breath, Rosa made a decision. She was not going to let these officers bully her, not here, not now. She had faced far worse in her life, and she wasn't about to let them strip her of her dignity. "I will not," she said clearly, her voice ringing out with the authority of someone who had seen the world change and fought for that change. "I have done nothing wrong, and I will not be treated like a criminal in my own home. If you want to arrest me, you'll have to physically remove me from this porch, and I promise you, I will not go quietly." The officers exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such defiance from an elderly woman. The male officer's grip on his holster tightened as he took another step forward, while the female officer looked hesitant, glancing back toward the patrol car as though unsure whether to escalate the situation further. As tension crackled in the air, Rosa silently prayed for strength. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let these officers strip away her dignity without a fight. Just as the situation seemed on the verge of spiraling out of control, the distant sound of a car engine approached. Rosa's heart leaped with hope as a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The officers barely registered the arrival, so focused were they on Rosa. Then, a commanding voice cut through the tense air. "What exactly is going on here?" All heads turned to see a tall, distinguished black man in his early 50s stepping out of the SUV. His tailored suit and authoritative stride immediately commanded attention, and Rosa's face lit up with a mixture of relief and pride. "Daniel!" she called out, her voice wavering slightly. "Thank God you're here." The lead officer stepped forward, attempting to assert control. "Sir, this is a police matter. I'm going to have to ask you to step back." But Daniel's eyes, sharp and filled with barely contained fury, were fixed on his mother, visibly shaken but holding her ground. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but there was no mistaking the anger beneath the surface. "Officer, he began, his tone measured. "I am Captain Daniel Williams of the City Police Department, and this woman," he gestured to Rosa, "is my mother." The officer's face drained of color as the realization of who they were dealing with sank in. The air between them thickened with tension as Captain Daniel Williams stood in front of the two officers. The man, who had moments ago been threatening to arrest Rosa, now looked stunned, his arrogance cracking beneath the weight of Daniel's calm but intimidating presence. He swallowed hard, his bravado faltering. Daniel's mother stood silently behind him, her face both relieved and filled with quiet pride, but the anger still simmered beneath her poised exterior. The male officer, Officer Burns, tried to recover from the shock. "Captain Williams," he stammered, his tone laced with hesitancy. "We're responding to a call about a suspicious person in the area. The description? Well, it matched your mother. We're just doing our job." Daniel's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. "Your job," he repeated, his voice steady but with an edge of steel, "is to serve and protect this community, not to harass an elderly woman sitting on her own porch." Officer Burns shifted on his feet, his hand still resting near his holster. "We didn't know she lived here," he said defensively. "We had a report from a neighbor." The female officer, Officer Reed, who had until now remained mostly silent, looked visibly uncomfortable. She took a small step forward, her voice softer. "Sir, we're not trying to cause trouble. It was a misunderstanding. We just need to verify—" Daniel cut her off with a sharp look. "A misunderstanding?" His tone dripped with disbelief. He took a step closer to the officers, his presence towering over them. "You've lived in this neighborhood for how long? And yet you didn't think for a second that maybe, just maybe, a black woman could live in one of these homes? Or were you too busy assuming that she didn't belong here based on her appearance?" Burns' face reddened with frustration, but he kept his voice measured. "With all due respect, Captain, we've had a lot of reports of suspicious activity lately. This isn't about race." Daniel's eyes flashed with controlled fury. He had spent his entire career dealing with men like Burns, men who hid their biases behind the thin veil of just doing their job. He knew exactly what this was about. He had seen it too many times, and now they were doing it to his own mother. "It's always about race," Daniel said coldly. "You look at my mother and see a criminal, but what you're really seeing is your own ignorance." Burns bristled, his defensiveness rising again. "Look, Captain, we're not here to debate race relations. We got a call. We responded. End of story." Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes locked on Burns. "End of story? You threatened to arrest my mother in her own home. Do you have any idea what that would have done to her? What it's already done?" His voice grew quieter, more dangerous. "This isn't the end of the story, Officer Burns. This is just the beginning." Burns, sensing the growing danger in Daniel's words, shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at Officer Reed, who was now looking visibly shaken. She hadn't expected the situation to escalate this far, and now the consequences of their actions were becoming painfully clear. "Captain," she began carefully, "we didn't mean any harm. If we made a mistake, we'll own up to it." Daniel turned his gaze toward her, his expression softening slightly, but still stern. "It's more than a mistake, Officer Reed. This is the product of a system that allows people like you to make assumptions about people like my mother, and I won't let it slide." As the officers stood frozen in place, Rosa watched from her porch, her eyes locked on her son. She had always known Daniel to be a man of principle, but seeing him here, standing up to his own colleagues in defense of her, filled her with both pride and sorrow. This wasn't the first time she had encountered racism, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But now, it was her son who had to bear the weight of confronting it head-on, not just as a black man, but as a leader in the police force. Burns cleared his throat, trying one last time to salvage the situation. "Captain, I understand you're upset, but we're just following protocol. If your mother can show us some ID, we can clear this up and be on our way." Daniel's face darkened with anger at the suggestion. "ID?" he repeated. "You want her to prove that she belongs in her own home?" "No, Officer Burns. She doesn't owe you anything. Not an explanation, not ID, not her compliance. She has every right to sit on this porch without being harassed by you or anyone else." The air crackled with tension. Officer Burns, now visibly frustrated and embarrassed, shifted his weight and shot a glance at Officer Reed. She avoided his eyes, her discomfort growing with every second. She could see how badly this situation had deteriorated, and she wasn't sure how to fix it. Burns, however, wasn't willing to back down completely. He crossed his arms, squaring his shoulders as he faced Daniel. "Captain, I get that this is personal for you, but we still have to follow up on the report. We're not leaving until we get some answers." Daniel's patience snapped. His voice dropped to a low, menacing tone. "You're not leaving?" he repeated. "Let me make this very clear, officer. You're going to leave, right now, and you're going to leave quietly." Burns opened his mouth to argue, but Daniel held up a hand, silencing him. "And then," Daniel continued, his voice ice-cold, "you're going to report to the precinct first thing tomorrow morning, where you'll be handing in your badge and your gun. You're finished, Burns. As of this moment, you're no longer a police officer." The silence that followed was deafening. Burns stared at Daniel in shock, his mouth hanging open, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. "Captain, you can't." "Oh, I can," Daniel interrupted, "and I will. You crossed the line today. You let your prejudice cloud your judgment, and now you're going to face the consequences." Officer Reed, standing next to Burns, looked like she was about to collapse under the weight of the situation. She tried to speak, her voice shaking. "Sir, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Please, I didn't know." Daniel turned to her, his expression softening slightly, but still firm. "You stood by and let it happen, Officer Reed. That's just as bad as pulling the trigger yourself. You'll be held accountable, too." Reed's face crumpled as she realized the gravity of what she had allowed to unfold. She nodded slowly, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry isn't enough," Daniel said quietly. "You need to be better. You all need to be better." Burns, his face flushed with anger and humiliation, finally spoke. "This isn't over, Captain. You can't just fire us like this." Daniel took a step closer to him, his eyes burning with righteous fury. "It is over, Burns. You're done here. Now leave, before I change my mind about not arresting you for harassment and misconduct." Burns stood frozen for a moment, his face a mix of fury and disbelief. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then thought better of it. With a sharp nod, he turned on his heel and stormed back to the patrol car. Reed, still shaken and on the verge of tears, followed him silently. As they got into the car, Daniel turned back to his mother, who had been watching the entire exchange in stunned silence. Rosa's eyes were filled with emotion, relief, pride, and a deep sadness. She had seen this kind of hatred before, but it was different this time. This time, it had come for her in her own home, and it had nearly taken something from her that she could never replace: her dignity. Daniel walked up the steps of the porch and knelt beside his mother's chair, gently taking her hand in his. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said, his voice soft, the anger fading away to reveal the hurt beneath. Rosa squeezed his hand, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "You did the right thing, Daniel. You stood up for what's right." Daniel nodded, but his heart was heavy. "I wish I didn't have to, Mom. I wish this never happened in the first place." Rosa sighed, looking out over the quiet street. The patrol car had driven off, leaving a strange stillness in its wake. "It's been happening for as long as I can remember," she said quietly, "but maybe now things can start to change." Daniel stood up, pulling a chair next to his mother and sitting down beside her. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the day hanging between them. Rosa's porch, once a place of peace, had become the site of a confrontation that would ripple through their lives and their community. And while the immediate danger had passed, both Rosa and Daniel knew that the fight was far from over. There were battles yet to come, battles against a system that had long been stacked against people like them. But they were ready. Together, they would face whatever came next. For now, though, they sat side by side, mother and son, the silence of the evening settling over them as they prepared for the long road ahead. The tension had barely begun to dissipate from the air when Rosa and Daniel sat together on her porch, the quiet evening settling around them like an uneasy calm. The weight of what had just happened lingered, thick and palpable. But for Daniel, the battle was far from over. He couldn't simply let what those officers had done go unnoticed. His duty as both a son and a captain of the police force demanded that there be consequences. Rosa, sitting upright with the quiet strength of a woman who had seen far too much in her life, squeezed Daniel's hand. Her soft, weathered voice broke the silence first. "Daniel, I don't want this to consume you," she said, her words laced with a lifetime of wisdom. "There's a difference between fighting for justice and letting anger take over." Daniel turned to her, his jaw tight. "It's not just anger, Mom. It's what they did to you. To think that in 2024, in your own home, they still see you as someone who doesn't belong here." Rosa smiled, though there was no joy behind it. "I've lived through worse, son. I've seen hatred wear a lot of different faces over the years. This isn't new to me." "That's the problem," Daniel said sharply, his frustration boiling over. "It's not new. It should have been over by now. You shouldn't have to deal with this anymore." Rosa looked at him with steady eyes. "I know you want to fix it, Daniel. I know it eats at you, but the way you go about it matters." Daniel exhaled, trying to find a balance between his anger and his sense of duty. He stood up abruptly, pacing in front of the porch, his hands balled into fists. "I can't let them get away with this," he muttered, more to himself than to his mother. "Not on my watch." Rosa watched him for a moment, her calm presence contrasting his restless energy. She had always admired his strength, his desire to make the world a better place. But she also knew that this fight, one against institutional racism, against ingrained prejudice, wasn't one that could be won through anger alone. As if sensing his internal struggle, she said quietly, "Do what you need to, Daniel. But don't let it change who you are." Daniel stopped pacing and looked at his mother. He knew she was right, but it didn't make the anger any easier to swallow. He wasn't just a son trying to protect his mother. He was a black captain in a predominantly white police force, standing in the middle of a broken system that he had fought his entire career to change. "I won't let it change me, Mom," he said finally, his voice steadier. "But I'm going to hold them accountable." He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. Rosa watched him dial, her expression unreadable. Daniel walked a few steps away from the porch, his voice low but firm as he spoke into the phone. "Chief Davis, it's Captain Williams," he began. "We need to talk right away." The conversation was short, and when Daniel hung up, he turned back to his mother, his expression resolute. "I'm going to the precinct." Rosa nodded but said nothing. She understood the weight he carried, the responsibility he felt not only to her, but to the community he served. "Be careful," she said softly. Daniel gave her a reassuring nod. "I'll be back soon. Don't worry." But as he walked to his SUV, parked just a few feet away from where the police cruisers had been earlier, Rosa couldn't help but worry. She had seen this before, how fighting against a system could break even the strongest people. And while Daniel was one of the strongest men she knew, the world he was up against was relentless. As he drove toward the precinct, his thoughts raced. The precinct where he worked, the one he'd dedicated so many years of his life to, was now the very place where he would be confronting the ugly truth of institutional racism. He had spent years building trust among his fellow officers, believing that he could change things from the inside. But tonight's events had shattered that fragile trust. It was clear that, despite his best efforts, The system was still deeply flawed. When Daniel arrived at the precinct, the building stood tall and impersonal, the bright fluorescent lights inside glowing coldly against the night sky. He stepped out of his car, his stomach tight with the weight of what he was about to do. As much as he wanted to remain calm, the images of his mother being threatened on her own porch still burned in his mind. Inside, the usual hustle of officers going about their duties continued, oblivious to the storm brewing in Daniel's mind. He walked through the hallways with purpose, his face set in grim determination. Every step felt heavier as he approached the office of Chief Davis, his superior, the man who had placed so much trust in Daniel over the years. Daniel knocked on the door and heard a gruff, "Come in." Chief Davis, a burly white man with graying hair and a commanding presence, sat behind his desk, looking over paperwork. He glanced up as Daniel entered, raising an eyebrow. "Williams, what's this about?" he asked, his tone neutral, but with a hint of curiosity. Daniel closed the door behind him, taking a deep breath. "We need to talk about Officers Burns and Reed," he said bluntly. Davis leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What about them?" "They harassed my mother tonight," Daniel said, his voice steady but cold. "They showed up at her house after a neighbor called in a suspicious person report. They assumed she didn't belong there because she's black." Davis's face hardened. "Are you saying they racially profiled your mother?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Daniel replied, his eyes never leaving Davis's. "They treated her like a criminal, threatened to arrest her in her own home, and when I arrived, they had her cornered." Burns had his hand on his gun. "This isn't just a misunderstanding, Chief. It's blatant racial profiling." The silence in the room grew thick. Chief Davis's jaw worked as he processed the information. He was a man who had seen his share of accusations and complaints, but this one hit differently. This wasn't coming from some civilian. This was from one of his most trusted captains. "Burns and Reed have been good officers," Davis said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. "Are you sure it wasn't just a mistake? Maybe they were overzealous. But racial profiling? That's a serious accusation, Williams." Daniel's hands balled into fists at his sides. "It wasn't a mistake. They targeted her because she didn't fit into what they think this neighborhood should look like. And if it can happen to her, it can happen to anyone." Davis rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. "Damn it, Daniel," he muttered. "This isn't something I can just sweep under the rug." "I'm not asking you to sweep it under the rug," Daniel shot back. "I'm asking you to take action. They need to be held accountable, and if they aren't, I'll make sure this goes public." Davis's eyes flicked up at the threat, his posture stiffening. "You know the department doesn't need that kind of attention, especially right now. We're barely holding things together as it is." "And that's the problem," Daniel said, his voice rising slightly. "We keep sweeping things under the rug, pretending like this isn't happening. But it is, Chief. It's happening every day. My mother isn't just another statistic. This needs to stop." Davis was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a heavy sigh, he leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "All right, Williams. I'll start an internal investigation, but you know as well as I do that this won't be easy. Burns and Reed will fight it, and so will the union." "I don't care how hard it is," Daniel replied, his voice unwavering. "I just want justice, for my mother, and for everyone else who's been through this." Davis nodded slowly, his gaze hardening. "Consider it done. I'll make sure the investigation is thorough. But Williams..." He paused, searching for the right words. "Just be careful. You're putting a lot on the line here." "I know," Daniel said, turning to leave. "But it's worth it." As he walked out of the office, the weight on his shoulders felt both heavier and lighter at the same time. He had taken the first step toward justice, but the battle was far from over. the internal investigation would be messy, and Daniel knew that Burns and Reed wouldn't go down without a fight. But this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about changing a system that had been broken for far too long. And if Daniel had to burn a few bridges along the way, so be it. As he drove back to his mother's house, the night sky above him vast and endless, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his mother anymore. He was fighting for all the people who didn't have someone to stand up for them, and he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The drive back to Rosa's house felt longer than usual for Daniel. The weight of what had transpired at the precinct lingered, like a heavy fog clouding his thoughts. As he turned down the familiar streets leading to his childhood home, Daniel's mind churned with the complexity of what lay ahead. Burns and Reed wouldn't go down without a fight. He knew that much. And while he had the power and authority to initiate their dismissal, the system would resist. The police union, internal politics, and a culture of protecting their own would complicate everything. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of his mother's house, where the soft glow of the porch light illuminated Rosa sitting quietly in her chair. The weight of the evening had clearly taken its toll on her, but she still held herself with the unshakable dignity that had carried her through decades of discrimination and hardship. Daniel took a deep breath as he got out of the car, his body heavy with exhaustion. As soon as he stepped onto the porch, Rosa looked up at him, her wise eyes searching his face. "How did it go?" she asked, though she could already read the tension in his expression. Daniel sat down beside her with a sigh. "Chief Davis is launching an internal investigation. Burns and Reed are going to be held accountable." Rosa nodded slowly, her face thoughtful but calm. "I knew you'd do the right thing." "I had to," Daniel replied, rubbing a hand over his face. "But it's going to be ugly, Mom. The union is going to push back hard. They'll protect Burns and Reed, and it's going to turn into a mess." Rosa reached out and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "It was always going to be a mess, Daniel. Change is never easy. But you're doing what's right, and that's what matters." Daniel met her gaze, feeling the warmth of her support, but also the weight of the battle ahead. He knew that this wouldn't be resolved overnight, and that this fight could cost him more than just his reputation within the department. He had already felt the undercurrents of tension with some of his colleagues, those who quietly harbored their own biases, or who would see his actions as a betrayal of the thin blue line. Daniel began, his voice low. "I don't want this to blow back on you. You've already been through enough." Rosa's expression softened, and she smiled faintly. "Daniel, I've been fighting this battle my whole life. What happened tonight wasn't new to me. What's different now is that you're in a position to do something about it." "I know," Daniel said, his voice filled with frustration. "But it shouldn't still be happening. Not to you. Not to anyone." Rosa let out a slow breath. "You can't change everything all at once, son. But you can make a start. That's all I ever wanted, to see things change, little by little. And maybe this is the start of something bigger." Daniel felt the knot in his chest loosen just a bit. His mother's calm wisdom had always been a guiding force in his life. And now, more than ever, he needed her perspective to ground him. She had lived through so much: segregation, the civil rights movement, the quiet prejudice that had followed her for decades. And yet, here she was, as strong as ever. "I just don't know how far this is going to go," Daniel admitted. "And I'm not sure if the department is ready to face what's coming." Rosa smiled gently, her eyes twinkling with that familiar spark of strength. "Then you lead the way, Daniel. You've always been a leader," he sighed, looking out at the quiet street. "I just hope they follow." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the warmth of the night wrapping around them. But the tranquility didn't last long. The distant hum of tires rolling on asphalt reached their ears, and soon a set of headlights turned the corner, cutting through the night like a blade. Daniel squinted at the approaching car, the tension returning to his body as the vehicle slowed and parked a few houses down. It was Mrs. Holland's car, the same neighbor who had called the police on Rosa earlier that evening. Daniel's jaw clenched as he watched her get out of the car, clutching her purse tightly as she approached them. He could already sense what was coming. Rosa noticed too, her eyes narrowing slightly as the woman drew nearer. "What does she want now?" Rosa muttered under her breath. Mrs. Holland, a middle-aged white woman with an overly formal posture, walked up to the porch, her face pale with a mixture of guilt and unease. She hesitated at the bottom of the steps, as if unsure of how to approach the situation. "Mrs. Williams, Captain Williams," she began, her voice awkward and strained. Daniel stood, crossing his arms as he stared down at her, his expression cold. "What do you want, Mrs. Holland?" The woman's eyes flickered nervously from Daniel to Rosa and back again. She was clearly uncomfortable being there, but something in her had driven her to come forward. I just wanted to apologize," she said hesitantly. "For earlier. I didn't realize it was... I didn't know." Rosa, who had remained seated, let out a quiet breath. "You didn't know what?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge. Mrs. Holland wrung her hands together, her gaze falling to the ground. "I didn't realize it was you. I thought, well, I saw someone sitting out here, and with all the things happening in the neighborhood lately, I panicked." Daniel's patience was already wearing thin. "So you panicked and called the police, without even thinking that maybe my mother has lived here longer than you have? You didn't think to come over and say hello? Introduce yourself?" Mrs. Holland flushed with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she stammered. "I just thought..." "You thought what?" Daniel snapped. "That because she's black she doesn't belong here?" Rosa raised a hand gently, signaling for Daniel to stop. He fell silent, though his jaw was still tight with anger. Rosa's gaze remained steady on Mrs. Holland, her expression unreadable. "You were afraid," Rosa said quietly, more of a statement than a question. Mrs. Holland nodded quickly, her face flushed with shame. "Yes, I was. I've been hearing about break-ins, and when I saw someone I didn't recognize sitting here, I just assumed the worst." Rosa leaned forward slightly in her chair, her voice calm but firm. "You didn't recognize me because you never tried to get to know me. I've lived in this house for 40 years, and you've never once stopped to introduce yourself. Instead, you looked at me and saw a threat." Mrs. Holland's eyes filled with tears as she realized the full extent of her mistake. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I really am." Rosa sat back in her chair, her gaze softening, though the hurt remained. "I appreciate your apology," she said after a long pause. "But this isn't just about me. This is about the way people like you see people like me. You didn't just call the police because you were afraid of a stranger. You called them because I don't fit into the picture of what you think this neighborhood should look like." Mrs. Holland's tears spilled over as she nodded, her voice cracking. "I know. And I'm sorry. I never thought about it that way before." Daniel, still standing with his arms crossed, remained silent, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He had no sympathy for Mrs. Holland's sudden guilt. Her apology felt too little, too late. But Rosa, ever the embodiment of grace, extended a small olive branch. "Maybe next time, instead of assuming the worst," Rosa said gently, "you can come over and say hello. You might find that we're not so different after all." Mrs. Holland nodded again, wiping at her eyes. "I will," she promised. "I really will." She lingered for a moment longer, clearly unsure of how to end the conversation. But Rosa simply gave her a small nod, signaling that it was time for her to go. With one last look at both of them, Mrs. Holland turned and walked back to her car, the tension still hanging in the air, but softened by Rosa's measured response. When the car finally drove away, Daniel let out a long, frustrated breath, shaking his head. "I don't know how you do it, Mom. I don't know how you can forgive people like that." Rosa smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with that familiar wisdom. "It's not forgiveness, son. It's understanding. She's part of the problem, but she's also part of the solution." Daniel sighed, sitting back down beside her. "I just don't know if I can do what you do." Rosa reached out and patted his hand. "You don't have to do what I do. You have your own way of fighting this battle. But don't lose yourself in the anger, Daniel. It's too easy to let it consume you." He nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he took in her words. "I'll try, Mom." For the first time that evening, the tension in Daniel's chest began to ease. He still had a long road ahead of him. The investigation into Burns and Reed, the inevitable pushback from the department, the fight for real change within a system that resisted it at every turn. But sitting here with his mother, he felt grounded. He wasn't alone in this fight. The consequences of tonight's events would ripple through their lives and their community. The confrontation with Burns and Reed was just the beginning. There would be battles to come, but with his mother by his side, Daniel felt ready. As the night deepened around them, Rosa and Daniel sat together in silence once again, watching the stars blink into the sky above. It was a peaceful moment in the midst of the storm, and Daniel knew they would need every bit of that peace to face what lay ahead, because the fight was far from over. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story like this. Hit the notification bell to stay updated. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other stories right here and make sure to watch the next one. You won't want to miss what happens.